Jim Chalmers' tax cuts today have been widely condemned across the board as small, insignificant, and according to the coalition, a hoax and a bribe. Well, if a $5 a week tax cut was slammed as too small 22 years ago, then it was even less welcome today. We're in a cost of living crisis where this meagre amount will be eroded by bracket creep within 2 years. Now, we spoke last night about how Costello announced a $5 a week tax cut in 2003. And at the time, his colleague Amanda Vanstone admitted that it would barely afford a sandwich and a milkshake. Well, here were those comments.
But the government's sales campaign was not helped by the Family and Community Services Minister, who was making a point on welfare payments.
Of course you want to give them $5 more. $5, hell, what will it buy you? A sandwich and a milkshake if you're lucky.
A sandwich and a milkshake if you're lucky. And that was 22 years ago. Well, since 2003, the cost of food and other goods has, of course, increased a multitude of times. It's why newspapers today describe the tax cut as Jim Pickings and Jim's coffee shot. And over at the Nightly, $5 a week, asterisk, next year sometime. The Adelaide Advertiser went with McHappy Meal Jim, where they said that the tax cut was not enough for a Macca's meal, while they said pandas at the zoo got $14,000 a week. Well, this was a theme that opposition leader Peter Dutton picked up on today.
70 cents a day. Either way, it's just a rounding error for families who, I think as the Adelaide Advertiser point out, you can buy a McHappy meal. A mate of mine just texted me and said, you know, he paid $14, I think, for 2 cups of coffee yesterday. So look, let's be realistic. This is it's a hoax. It's about the next 5 weeks, not the next 5 years. And for 70 cents a day, it's not going to help families in Labor's cost of living crisis.
But this is all about politics. Labor introduced these tax cuts to the Parliament today so that they can then claim during the election that the coalition voted against tax cuts. Now, of course, this is a political gimmick, a trick, because the coalition is likely to announce their own tax cuts tomorrow night. During the budget lockup in Canberra yesterday, I spoke to the Treasurer and I put to him that this budget was all about the campaign.
Treasurer, thank you so much. Great to see you today.
Thanks, Sharri. You too.
This is a highly political pre-election budget, isn't it?
No, this is a budget which recognises the economic pressures that people are facing, cost of living pressures and global economic uncertainty. Topping up the tax cuts is an important way that we recognise and respond to those cost of living pressures in a way that builds people's take-home pay over time.
So he called it topping up the tax cuts, and he did acknowledge that it was a modest, that was his word, modest tax cut. He said this was responsible. But then he also tried to frame the tax cuts today as being worth around $50.
The average annual tax cut after this year's and next year's is $2,548 or about $50 a week.
Well, it's more than that, Sarah. That's the first point. If you combine the 3 tax cuts that Labor is providing, it's around $50 a week. There are 2 rounds of additional tax cuts, and together with the tax cuts which are flowing now, the average is about $50 a week.
Of course, the coalition today hit back at this. They claimed that it was under the coalition, that the stage 3 tax cuts were first announced. Now, my colleague Andrew Clennell called the Treasurer out on this figure during the budget lockup yesterday.
And so these tax cuts in isolation are relatively modest.
They are modest. They're worth about that much a week.
Yeah, in combination with the tax cuts that we're already delivering, the average tax cut's about $50 a week. Yeah, so a pineapple.
Not about these ones. You don't get a pineapple this time. You're giving people a cup of coffee a week, aren't you?
Well, this is about topping up the tax cuts which are flowing already.
Now, the other theme that we've all been speaking about is the size of the spending in the budget. Now, as Matthew Cranston reported in the Australian newspaper today, Jim Chalmers has presided over the biggest deterioration in the country's underlying cash balance outside COVID and the global financial crisis, with a $43 billion plunge into the red from a surplus last year. And the thought of how the record windfall from the mining industry, the high commodity prices and the record level of tax receipts have been squandered is quite concerning. And the size of our nation's debt is astonishing. It will hit, as you know now, $1 trillion for the first time in Australia's history next financial year. $1 trillion in debt. As I said on Sky last night, this is a shocking figure, especially when there's no vision or no nation-building project to show for it. And then you look at why Labor is racking up this level of debt. Well, one of the most reckless wastes of money is to cut 20% of all student loan debts. This is $19 billion in debt for 3 million Australians. This is about buying the young vote, which has moved away from Labor and towards independent Teal candidates or minor parties, including the Greens. So Albanese claims he wants to help young voters, but instead he's saddling our future generations with an unprecedented bill to pay. Then there's the $33 billion for a housing fund that still hasn't built a single home. And I asked the Treasurer how anyone could believe that a house would be built when it hasn't so far.
On the your $33 billion to deliver 1.2 million new homes within 5 years by the end of the decade, doesn't that stretch credibility when the existing Future Fund hasn't delivered a single house? The existing Housing Australia Fund hasn't delivered a single new house.
It's an ambitious goal, but it's achievable if everybody does their bit. And what the budget shows is that we're prepared to do our bit. $33 billion of investment, including some initiatives budgeted for the first time in this budget.
We need 1.2 million homes in 5 years?
Well, we're only at the start of that 5-year period, and we will do everything we can to hit that target, because we want to make sure that there are more homes for Australians to rent and buy, and that's the motivation for our effort.
Now, that's outside of his control, but the housing ministers have a lot to answer for here. So does the Prime Minister. And there's been criticism today across the board that there hasn't been any serious attempt to rein in spending or tackle the sustainability of bloated schemes that are blowing out. The NDIS is the most obvious example. Now, spending in the budget runs to $50 billion more per year than the country is collecting in tax. And it seems like the Albanese government has given up on a balanced budget, at least for the time being, at least to win this election. But what is the plan if there's an economic downturn or international shock with this current level of borrowing? And the Treasurer has warned about global volatility. And as others have pointed out, debt is so high that we'll be paying $48 billion in interest in 4 years' time, the 7th highest item in spending into the budget. And it's been reported that it's set to soon eclipse Medicare outgoings. Now, Peter Dutton hasn't made this very clear as yet. We might see it tomorrow night, but he appears to be promising a more fiscally conservative approach.
This is the Treasurer now who will deliver $1 trillion worth of debt to the Australian public, which is a terrible legacy, but an expected one from a Labor government.
So we'll need to see tomorrow night exactly what the figures are under the Coalition's proposed plan. Now, Jim Chalmers is right that he didn't spend the higher than expected revenue from commodity prices and tax receipts. But then Peter Dutton made the point that Labor's first 2 surpluses were delivered partly because the Coalition had done some of the hard work, and that is to Josh Frydenberg's credit. But the Coalition can't go to an election opposing tax cuts. That is electoral suicide. Now, they've long signalled that they are going to bring tax relief, and it will now need to be more substantial than Labor's modest $5 a week cuts. But the Coalition needs to pay for it. So the Coalition claims to be the party of better and more responsible economic management. So if they're going to offer more generous tax cuts, they will need to balance the books and show how they'll pay for it. They've criticised Labor for announcing some $67 billion in new spending measures over the past 3 months alone. But much of these promises they've matched. So the danger for the Coalition will be in wanting to match these populist measures dollar for dollar. Labor has now used the budget as the start of their election campaign. This is the basis they'll use to argue for a second term in office. But there's no vision for Australia or for our future. It's all about buying the election.